things are just changing at an incredible rate. And it's not certain where it's all going to land, but it is very certain that it's changing in ways that are bigger than the changes that we've experienced so far.
This is Tim Morten. He shaped StarCraft II. Now he's leading Blizzard veterans to build the next great strategy game.
There were probably 2 people at the whole company who had ever released a game before, so most of us just had no idea what we were doing. Claude Code, Codex, like the code models have advanced so far that everybody I talk to is leveraging those to greater or lesser extents, and some places are just like all in, and it's amazing. Right now, today, single creators can make games with AI. It's going to unlock creativity for a lot of people.
Do you think bigger companies or smaller companies get the most out of this new era of AI and tech?
That's a thought-provoking question.
Tim, thanks so much for coming here today. For our audience, I'm in San Francisco with Tim Morten, and it's the last day of GDC, the Games Dev Conference this year. So definitely a long week.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
Absolutely. So I'm so excited to spend some time with Tim today, who is the CEO and production director at Frost Giant Studios, which is a studio he co-founded 6 years ago. And beforehand, he was the production director at Blizzard, where he managed the whole production for StarCraft, crazy, huge game. And even before that, he was a senior producer at Santa Monica Studios, where he led pre-production for God of War. And I can keep going on your past experiences with EA and more, but I think I'll stop here and we'll dive more on your background during our chat.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So, Tim, tell me a bit about how you grew up, your early childhood. What do you think could point that you're gonna have this career journey? You're gonna be into games, create such amazing experiences.
Well, yeah, definitely. Everything I've worked on has been a team effort. So, I feel like I've only contributed small parts to what I've been involved in. But growing up, I grew up in the era where Atari 2600 was a thing. And the place I grew up was East Coast, exotic New Jersey. And diners are a thing in New Jersey. It's just maybe a little more common out there than it is here in California. But so I would go with my dad to a local diner on the weekends to have breakfast, and they started getting arcade machines. And I think probably the first one I remember them getting was Space Invaders, but they certainly had like Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man and whatever, Star Castle over the years. And thankfully, my dad, was intrigued and would put the quarters out to be able to play these games. So, yeah, so I had a little exposure at home through early Atari systems and a little exposure at the diner. But yeah, you don't as a kid, you're not like, oh, this is a job I can do, especially at that point, because there was hardly even an industry around it. But just loved games, I guess. So.
That's awesome. Wow. And then how did you decide to go and study computer science? So you're by training an engineer. So did that passion kind of unravel over your teenage years?
I think like a lot of people at that point in time, computers were such a new thing. And all my friends had Apple computers or, Commodore computers, but we had an IBM at home, which is probably the least good for gaming of all the PCs. But, really text adventures were coming into their own at that point. And graphics obviously didn't matter so much there. So, yeah, my dad got Zork 1 with the IBM PC that he bought, and so I played that. And BASIC, just interpreted BASIC, came with the PC. So it was a natural progression to try to recreate that style of game, just using interpreted BASIC, which you can totally do. And of course, what I did was nowhere near as cool as the Infocom games, but it's still, you could parse English language and progress through a predetermined map. And yeah, it was a great learning experience anyway.
Wait, so your dad was a gamer? Like your dad was, interested in purchasing games and then having them set up and played?
Yeah,
That's
definitely I
amazing.
owe my career to his interest in it, for sure.
Okay, awesome. So you go on to study computer science. So at what point was this, like during your studies, that you start realizing, oh my God, games could be, a career?
I had finished, like just gotten out of college, and at that point in time, you're faced with this: what am I going to be? What am I going to do? Your parents obviously are expecting you to get a job, and so I remember there was a lot of talk at that point, which would have been '93, I guess. A lot of talk at that point about interactive television. And
Where's that?
it never really happened. But, there were big companies like Time Warner that spun up interactive groups and just like a lot of coverage about how infrastructure for transmitting the data, and it was going to be the coolest thing ever. So coming out with a computer science degree, I didn't want to just go like sit in a cubicle at Hewlett Packard or IBM or something. So the idea of being involved in entertainment sounded compelling. And again, it's not occurring to me that video games are an option because it's just not as big an industry at that point. I interviewed for like Time Warner and some of those other media companies, but there was an advertisement for Activision. I was like, Activision, like I played so much Pitfall growing up. This sounds amazing. So I responded to the ad, just, completely cold, no referrals or anything. And I was fortunate that they were hiring and called me in for an interview.
That's amazing. So where was that? Did you move for that, for Activision?
I was already living in LA,
Okay.
so I was, job hunting there. And yeah, Activision was up in Brentwood at that point in time.
Amazing. So tell us about these early years. We're talking, 94 to, end of the 90s. How was gaming back then? So like when you arrived at Activision, what were you faced with?
Activision back then was a very different company. So it was less than 50 people.
Wow.
It had been purchased by Bobby Kotick and his partners. So it was under new leadership. They relocated the company from up here in the Bay Area down to LA. And very few people there had ever released a game. There was just this sense of figuring out together how to build games. And it was just this tiny little office. There was probably a foot of free fall when you started going down in the elevator that was terrifying. But, just so different from the massive company that Activision became. The funny thing was, because there wasn't enough space, even though I was hired as a programmer, obviously, they put me in the office supply cubicle because there wasn't enough space. And other people working there see somebody sitting with the office supplies. They're like, oh, that must be the office supply manager. So, and I sat there, so I knew where everything was. So people would show up and be like, hey, I need a legal pad or I need a pen. And I'd just, take it off the shelf and give it to them. And when we later moved offices, people would come ask me for office supplies. And I'm like, I'm really sorry. It's not actually what I do. But anyway, yeah, that was the early days. But, I think the most striking thing really was that there were probably 2 people at the whole company who had ever released a game before. So most of us just had no idea what we were doing.
Wow. And then you, and I guess Activision back then being so small, everyone was wearing multiple hats. So you started getting involved in the production itself.
That happened a little later. Yeah, I think production as a discipline wasn't very well defined at that point in time, and there wasn't a lot of methodology around it at Activision. As somebody who was an individual contributor, I think we all felt some organizational frustrations of just like, there's got to be a better way to implement processes and make this work. So it was kind of a reaction to those frustrations that led me to gravitate more towards production. But I was still programming and producing, but it led me in that direction.
What did production look like back then? What was the pipeline like?
Team sizes were so much smaller, ranging from 5 to like 20 would be a really big team at that point in time. It was a period in the industry where people were getting fascinated with this idea of creating giant documents of like GDD, game design documents, and tech design documents that were literally phone book sized in some cases. So I think production did involve a little bit of maybe over documentation, trying to prepare for projects, but it definitely also was coming up with implementation strategy, sort of high level product vision, at least coordinating it, and then overseeing the execution.
So who was writing all of those phone book thick documents?
Yeah, I mean, for the game design, there definitely were already discrete designer roles, and usually the whole team would come together to contribute parts, but really designers and lead designers especially.
Wow.
And yeah, tech design side, obviously, a tech director or lead programmer would do a lot of that. But it is funny to look back on, how this phone book sized thing that was created at the beginning of a project mapped to what actually happened when the project, it just wasn't tremendously useful. I think, some amount of forethought is good, but anyway.
Yeah, then after that book, I guess the project becomes alive and they start implementing it. So it has its own.
So much is organic. I think the idea that at the beginning of a project that what the coolest thing that's going to come out of the production process is going to be is kind of flawed. But
yeah, makes sense. Okay, sounds good. So you worked on some very cool stuff over there. Return to Zork and MechWarrior 2. So what? How did you think about your next step? Obviously, spanning off from Activision to move on and actually lead your own studio, which was the Savage Entertainment.
Yeah, we inside had grown to 8 production teams at Activision, so it had gotten quite big.
Within 5 years?
Yeah, it had moved buildings.
Again?
Yeah, again. And by that point in time, Activision was also doing some third-party deals, particularly id Software. So they were publishing id's games at that point. And, as a builder, you look at the freedom that an external studio, and it of course was incredibly successful. So you look at the just freedom and success that they were enjoying and feel a certain amount of, we're making games. We could do that outside too.
Yeah.
I approached my boss, which is a really scary thing to do when you're going to say hey, is there a way that we could do this independently and still work with Activision? Because if he says no, then you're is he going to fire me? I don't know. It turned out that another group had approached with exactly the same proposal the week before. And that was the Pandemic guys. I don't know if you remember Pandemic Studios, but they made some really great games, and they were friends of ours. And so this idea had kind of already been presented, and therefore the reaction that we got was maybe a little less scary than I feared. And
Nice.
I'm so grateful really to Activision for giving me that chance to experience what it's like to manage a studio outside.
Makes sense. So you took a risk there, and it worked. And then you got to grow your own company. And so what would you say were the biggest highlights from those 12, 13 years at Savage, and any stories you want to share?
Yeah, the industry really was powered by publishers and distributors because physical goods were still such an important part of the business at that point, and the publishers and distributors were the ones who had access to retail channels and the capital, obviously, to finance new projects. A lot of games were licensed IP. Almost everything we worked on was, Transformers or Star Wars, Star Trek, James Bond, just so many licensed IPs. But what we didn't understand coming from an internal dev team to becoming an external company was that you have to spend so much more of your attention managing the business, all the operational stuff, drumming up new business, all of these support functions like even sound design or just, we had all these resources available to us. We didn't have to think about that stuff as an internal team, but as an external company, you're responsible for everything. But even more impactful, as an internal team, you don't really have pass-fail moments. You've got to get the product done, and that's important. But, if you need more time, typically an internal team just gets more time. Yeah. So you can really focus on trying to build something that's high quality. Yeah. As an external team, typically every month or maybe every 6 weeks, but on a very regular cadence, you've got this pass-fail moment. And if you fail, you're not getting paid. Your team's not getting paid. Your whole company could go away. And what I found was that led to many circumstances where you couldn't prioritize quality. You had to prioritize expediency, because if you didn't, you're dead. And I really felt like the games that we built, even though we were proud of finishing them, weren't products that I look back on and think, wow, that was really a great game. I'm proud of that game. But once you're outside, it's not like, you can just jump back in. You continue to try to make it work. And our aspiration always was to try to build something original, to sort of make enough money with the licensed games that we were working on to build something that we really were proud of. But you're kind of stuck on a hamster wheel of trying to keep the revenue coming so that everybody's paychecks get paid every 2 weeks. And it's a really tough business.
Very tough. Extremely impressive everything that you did there. And so was this the motivation after more than a decade to move on? Did you actually create any of your own IP there, or did you say, okay, I see this is a hamster wheel, I won't get to do this time with this company, I'll move on?
We were constantly doing demos of original IP, and we would shop those around, and publisher would be like, oh, this would make a great Jurassic Park game, or this would make a great He-Man game, and it would have to turn into licensed IP. But we and I had a couple of great partners at that company too. But I think we were kind of victims of the just keep trying till you succeed, no matter how difficult or frustrating or how long you go without a page. Just keep going till you succeed. And at a certain point, there was a recession in 2008. It didn't impact games industry immediately, but our biggest customer was THQ at that point in time, and THQ did fall victim to that recession. We had 2 cancellations, and we just couldn't recover, so we had to move on.
Makes sense. Becoming the director of product development at EA at a studio called Victory Games, how did you find this next step? And do you have any highlights to share from there? Now we're in 2010, 11. How has the industry progressed?
Well, I think the biggest thing there for me was having come out of early Activision that was really small, and then this kind of scrappy indie studio that had only really had exposure to the way Activision did things, having the chance to work at EA, which was just a behemoth. I mean, they're still an amazingly successful company, but at that point in time, I mean, they were just number one, hands down. And so I was really eager to learn and see how EA approached things. And I was fortunate to get a chance to work with a team that had a lot of experience. My boss there was John Van Caneghem, who created Might and Magic and Heroes of Might and Magic, and just really veteran developer. So it was a great team. I think EA as a company, there's a lot about being a big public company that maybe isn't always player friendly, but still, they as a company have done so much to help break down what are the phases of game development, how do you approach this in a way that is effective, and so there really is a lot of goodness at EA, and it's I think tough being a public company to always put customers first. But anyhow, it really was a great experience, and I got to work on a franchise that I love as a player, Command and Conquer. It's a very big company. It's a public company, and so it's so different from being independent.
Makes sense. So in terms of like the lessons learned from there when it comes to, creating processes that, improve efficiency, what would you say were the biggest lessons?
Well, team size there now, is orders of magnitude from these 20-person teams at Activision. So there was a lot around how to coordinate a team that's now approaching 100 people in different locations, with many more even support departments than we had back in the Activision days. So operating at scale, I think, was a big part of it, but also being very deliberate about phases of game development, ideation, pre-production, production, post-production, like really thinking about what needs to happen to get the team through a gate, as EA would call them, into the next phase of the framework. And those are useful exercises. I think there's not a lot of rigor organically in game development, and so thinking about some of those things in a rigorous way, I think, genuinely is helpful.
Makes sense. And so what was your day-to-day leading that project as a director of product dev?
I got to spend most of my time team-facing, which is like building is my favorite thing. I was at a point there where I was no longer engineering directly, but just coordinating. So it's a little more vicarious, the satisfaction of things that do get done. But working with design, art, engineering, and production to define the goals, execute against those goals, and then to a lesser extent, but still important, managing the relationship of the team with the rest of the company and the executive leadership. And thankfully, my boss handled a lot of that, so I didn't necessarily have to spend the bulk of my time managing up. But in a big company, that managing up is a very important aspect too.
Part of the process. Yeah. Makes sense. So very structured processes there, defined steps to bring a game into the world. Back then, how much would you say all the prototyping and pre-production accounted for in that pipeline? Was this like a well iterated process as part of the pre-production or prototyping, or was it pretty fast? Like how would you think about that?
For that game in particular, there was a technology pivot that happened where there was legacy tech that prior Command & Conquer games had been built on.
Got it.
That was like mid-production. It was decided sort of top-down that we, along with many other teams around the company, would move to the Frostbite engine. And using a shooter engine for an RTS is not immediately obvious how you do that well. So there was a lot of preparatory work, which really brings things back into pre-production, because until those pipelines are working and you've proved out how the game is going to feel and how assets are going to flow into the game. You're not in full production. So that pre-production process was a bit protracted for that game as a result.
So, so in terms of pre-production, has this definition changed, like in terms of, okay, what you just described points me to a conclusion that like pre-production is essentially testing out the pipeline for how you bring the assets in the game and how, you know, all of the story unfolds and like other bits as well. But not so much an iteration of different versions of the game. Am I right in that assumption?
To be fair, there should still, by this model, by this way of thinking, still be some gameplay iteration going on. Like it's perfectly reasonable to still be finding the fun during pre-production. But also what you said, that you're hopefully establishing confidence that you can create each kind of asset in a way that's ready for full production. And so there's both creative experimentation, but also pipeline development and experimentation going on.
I see. And when you're making a sequel, I am guessing that it's much less of the like iteration of the fun and like the player, or would you say that's not true?
I think, often sequels have the benefit of so many of those problems being solved that you're right. I think sometimes sequels really try to make a big departure, and sometimes that's successful, sometimes it isn't. But I can think of some examples from prior Command & Conquer games, for example, where they really tried to pivot, and those probably do require more pre-production time. But,
makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to move on to Blizzard before we come to Frost Giant and talk a bit about StarCraft, where you were the production director for 6 years. How did you decide to join that production? And tell us a bit about the game, the lessons there, as well as what you were responsible of as a production director.
Totally. Yeah, I had, after the Command & Conquer project that I was working on, unfortunately got shut down. There was a change in leadership at the company and just new strategy. So I had gone to Sony. God of War team was an amazingly talented team, and it's close to where I live. So, a lot of things that were great about it. But I had a friend that was working on StarCraft, and I just got lunch to catch up, and he was like, there's this thing going on. And the thing was that they were spinning up a game with the same engine that was going to be a MOBA. And it was, I didn't know at the time, but Heroes of the Storm. And so the senior leadership from StarCraft was shifting their focus over to that, which meant they needed some new leadership to come in on StarCraft. And StarCraft is one of my favorite games of all time. It's like, a game that I would buy copies of to give to my friends to get them playing. So I was just a fan of the game. But, it was an hour south of where I live. I had a really cool job. Like, God of War is an amazing team, amazing game. So I wasn't thinking, I'll go do that.
Yeah.
But he really encouraged me to at least have the conversation. And just as I got deeper into it, it's so rare that you have an opportunity to go work on something that you're already a fan of. It was still clear that there was tons that could be done with it. So it was just, too good an opportunity to...
I can see how happy you were. Like your eyes just light up. Okay, so production director, tell us a bit about like what were you overseeing? What was the production looking like for this? And just for the audience, this is like 2015 to like 2020 span of time.
Yeah, getting into Blizzard, the other big companies that I had worked at, EA, Activision, had been very driven by publishing in terms of their goals. And so I had never seen a team or a company at the scale that Blizzard had at that point that was developer driven. And I absolutely attribute that to the Blizzard founders being devs themselves. It's just the lens that they looked at the world through. And so, yeah, it was a really special place coming into a high-performing team, a product that was already successful. There was work in progress on the conclusion to the StarCraft II story, Legacy of the Void, but was really fortunate to be able to help steer the direction of that and everything that came after. So.
Okay, let me drill a bit more. So you said it was very developer driven. What does this mean in the context of building games?
Most other large companies, the stakeholder that is the most important stakeholder is publishing. And at Blizzard, it was reversed. Publishing was kind of a service department for development. And so one great example, just coming pretty quickly from EA to Blizzard, was that at EA, every month we would scrub our projected costs versus our actual costs, and just like a lot of financial rigor on the production of the game. And so it's just what I was used to coming out of EA. And I got to Blizzard, and a few months had passed that I was in the role. I hadn't talked to finance at all. I was like, man, we're getting really behind on this. I'm feeling nervous that I'm going to get in trouble. So I sought out the head of finance and said, I'm so sorry, I just started here, but when can we schedule our review? And he was like, yeah, no, just make a good game. Don't worry about that. And
you were like, sorry, what?
But yeah, like how that's impossible. But yeah, that was absolutely the culture there. So.
And how do you think that affected people's mindset, right? Like anywhere from people doing hands-on art or engineering, like up to you, obviously being a director. How do you think that shifts the mindset of people making the game?
It's a wonderful thing to be able to just try to produce the best work that you can produce. I think there are challenges that come with that. I think perfection can be the enemy of good. There are these expressions that have some truth to them. And Blizzard definitely took a long time to make games. Sometimes like the project that ultimately led to Overwatch, but the work that went into the project before that didn't pan out, and that can be expensive when it's a culture that is so quality focused. So there's good and bad to both approaches, but I think as a developer, like as a creator, working in an environment that is just about trying to do the best work that you can, I mean, that's just the dream environment.
The dream.
So,
and do you think, you also mentioned the team being very high performant, do you think that kind of like was one of the reasons why the team was so motivated? Or
for sure. Yeah, I think Blizzard had the benefit of so many years of great games before I got there that I think it attracted people who just loved the work that Blizzard had already done and wanted to be part of their future. So.
Awesome. And did the production of StarCraft, when you joined, included any sort of like innovations or technology changes from what you were used to that you think we should highlight here?
Blizzard was building custom engines for all their games at that point, and they're still pretty much operating in that way. For real-time strategy, I think the work that was done on StarCraft II really was benchmark setting. And it's interesting that in some ways part of the charm of the first StarCraft was struggling against the engine to accomplish what you wanted to accomplish as a player, just units whose pathfinding are maybe not ideal, but it becomes part of the charm of the game.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that fixing those things and really leveling up the capabilities of the engine, it's one of the things that I think created some polarization between those audiences, like the StarCraft I audience that just loves everything about StarCraft I, including those quirks, felt like a fish out of water coming into StarCraft II that felt so different. But it really was an amazing technology accomplishment and a credit to the engineers who built it. But because every engine is its own special snowflake, you don't necessarily get the same economies of scale building great tools and great pipelines. So, you look at those pipelines versus an Unreal, for example, today, and it's not the same level of artist friendliness that you have. So.
Makes sense. And as a production director, what was the main challenges that you would say you had to solve for extremely custom pipelines, from what I'm hearing, for each of the games?
Yeah, for me coming in, the biggest thing was just that you had this big monolithic team that was bifurcating between two projects, and there were areas where we were completely sharing engineers at the beginning, for example, and it was clear that the priorities of the new project were going to compromise goals for what we wanted to do on StarCraft II. And
the new project being the mobile, right?
Yeah, being Heroes of the Storm. And so there was a little bit of a period of having to fully separate the two so that they wouldn't have any negative impact on each other. But from a pipeline perspective, really it was kind of just polishing and improving what had already been there from all levels to try to facilitate what we wanted to accomplish with Legacy of the Void.
Okay, awesome. So tell us a bit about the transition, the last transition from Blizzard to Frost Giant, and again, what motivated you to start another company 6 years ago?
I really wanted to do a new RTS at Blizzard, and I think...
Why?
Well, StarCraft had concluded as a story, and there was more that we could do in that universe, but it felt like there was an opportunity to tell a new story and to start to explore some new gameplay ideas. And so that was exciting. Just Blizzard had the people who knew this genre incredibly well, had the creative environment that was so wonderful. So many reasons that building a new RTS at Blizzard was my first choice. But, from a business perspective, Blizzard's, for completely understandable reasons, was focused on some other projects at that point, particularly Diablo 4 and Overwatch 2. And as time has gone by, team sizes have gotten so big, those projects were just hungry for resources. And so the path, had I stayed, I think, many of the developers who had been involved in StarCraft would have naturally been absorbed by those teams. And it just, there wasn't an opportunity at that point in time to do a new RTS at Blizzard. So, leadership was super gracious. I had the conversation about doing the new RTS, and it certainly wasn't the case that they're not fans of the genre or that they didn't want to do it, but it's just the business reality was what it was. And they were supportive of me saying, well, I think I'm going to try to do this externally. And they were super nice about it. But.
That's awesome. What are, so obviously having had a career of 20 plus years at that point, what were the biggest learnings that you took with you when you started Frost Giant?
Well, I'd gone through that past startup experience where we got stuck on the hamster wheel. And so I was really determined to go into this one not doing licensed projects for big publishers, but just really trying to focus on this original idea. And I had some contact, with the Supergiant guys before they released their first game, and I think they faced this same conundrum, and it turned out really well for them. So I was like, all right, like here's an example. It is possible. There's a path to do this. So that was my goal in going, and I think my number one thing was just like, let's not screw around with doing this other stuff. Let's just try to build a really cool original game.
Sounds good. And then tell us a bit about the past 6 years, obviously setting all of this up from scratch. What were all the stages that you went through before releasing the game?
Yeah, I didn't realize when I left that it was even possible to do equity funding for a game studio, because previously when I was at the other startup, that just wasn't available. I'd had some conversations, but VCs...
too early days for that.
Too hit-driven was their feeling. So I was super fortunate just in that there was an ecosystem of venture capital funding that had spun up specifically around game content. So fairly quickly, faster than I expected, there was an offer to provide some money to start the company and start to bring some people over. Because we still felt very much part of the Blizzard family, we worked closely with our friends at Blizzard to make sure that we weren't negatively impacting Blizzard projects as people came over. So it was a little slower transition, I think, than a lot of times when people leave a company and start something. But we did get a really talented core group of folks from the StarCraft team to come over.
Wow. They followed you.
I think the team is so passionate about this genre. It's just, everybody
sense.
Really wanted to make another one. And then we, much like I described when Command & Conquer pivoted engines, we'd had this amazing engine. At Blizzard, that was no longer something we had access to. We started experimenting with Unreal, and it took quite a long period of time to understand the right way to do things in Unreal, but also where, just like Frostbite, Unreal was coming from a different genre. What did we need to layer on top of Unreal to really make a solid foundation for RTS?
Interesting. So how did you go about it?
We were fortunate to have one of the engineers who had built the StarCraft II engine, and so he was very instrumental in defining the architecture. And there's that great, when you've done something before, wanting to one-up yourself and take those learnings and apply them. So he did some amazing work building that foundation.
Wow. So he built on top of Unreal, but your own layer, essentially.
Yeah, he actually built it completely independently from Unreal at first. And then we sat it on top and kind of created the coupling in between. But RTS is just unique in the number of units that need to be network synced. There are not a lot of genres that have that requirement. There's utility for things like sports games or other kinds of strategy games. But even in Battle Royale, where theoretically there's 100 or 100 plus players, they're not typically all on screen at the same time. And in RTS, we need thousands. So it's just, it has a ripple effect from everything to the network code, to the pathfinding, to the collision, to the physics, it just goes on and on. So
big engineering challenge.
Yeah.
It's not like you're also an engineer. Okay, and did you also follow the same production process that we described back from your EA days, or did that get iterated through your Blizzard time as well?
Yeah, I think at a startup, things always are a little bit more organic, but so many of us having come out of Blizzard and also EA tried to apply some of the same rigor. I would say we didn't completely succeed, but at least the intention was there. So,
Okay, and then sorry. Obviously, Frost Giant being a game company of the past 6 years, do you have any new tech or innovation that you guys uncovered that you would highlight as a big difference? That's something that made a big difference compared to like the previous 20 years of production in games.
Yeah, good question. I think on the just production management side, there's so many great subscription tools that had emerged, and it's interesting. A lot of times, big companies take a long time to adopt new tools like that, and so it was nice as a startup to be able to take advantage of stuff like Notion and Favreau, and just I wish there were something as easy on the asset management side. Like we tried Plastic and ran into some scaling issues, and ultimately wound up having to go back to Perforce. But anyway, just a lot of sort of software subscription services that made things a lot easier. I think on the pipeline side, definitely Unreal has been able to invest a lot in its pipelines, and some aspects of that we couldn't take advantage of as much. Blueprints, for example, don't really support determinism, so we needed determinism for our network model. But the art pipelines, I think, were largely beneficial and useful to us. We used Blender,
Nice.
and we tried really hard to use Blender for animation as well. But at least at that point in time, we just wound up falling back to Maya for the animation side. But it's one of those nice things that when there's a reset, you get to just survey and see what's available.
Choose your tools.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And then I'm just going to get us into this AI theme slowly. So how, obviously being a studio owner and like founder and CEO, how have you been observing all of this AI wave and shift, especially coming from like the creative space? And what do you think people are thinking?
Initially, there was a lot of fear and skepticism, and I think there's very good reasons for that. But yeah, as a startup, I think we're again a little more able to just experiment and try stuff and see what's possible. Especially at this GDC, everybody's talking about AI. And part of it is, I think, just being in San Francisco, which is such an epicenter, but part of it is also just how quickly everything is starting to have impacts. And for Stormgate, very limited in terms of the impact that AI had. We did use Gen AI for some of the talking heads, and that was something that we just couldn't have done because we didn't have a team size to support it otherwise. So it was supplemental, and I think players were divided on that. Probably some things about our implementation that could have been better with that specifically, but and certainly things like Stable Diffusion had gotten to a point that it could at least help ideate. We didn't use it for any production assets. 11 Labs, super useful on the voice side. Again, we used real voice actors for everything, but when you're prototyping stuff, like that's a fast shortcut.
Oh my God! So you guys did use a lot of different tools.
The things that were maturing as we were coming to production, but now I think Claude Code, Codex, like the code models have advanced so far that everybody I talk to is leveraging those to greater or lesser extents, and some places are just like all in, and it's amazing to see how that's impacted their production. That wasn't as mature as we were finishing up, and I think on the content side, even though we experimented a little bit, I think part of it was our own headspace just wasn't there. Like, we're used to doing things the way we were doing things, but also those pipelines feel like they're just a little behind the code side in terms of maturing. So.
Makes sense. I mean, it sounds like you guys were some of the earliest adopters. If you're talking about like 11 Labs 1 or 2 years ago and other tools, it's actually rare to see that. So, what do you think is the future of all of this? Like, how do you see, games this year, next year, like a couple of years from now being made?
I talked to so many other studios just, about the business and how everybody's doing things. And AI always comes up now. I think we're all curious to learn from each other how it's being used. And it's so interesting that even some studios that take publicly anti-AI stances, like their team members are still experimenting and, using it. I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns about AI, but I also think it's coming. It's going to transform many industries, and games is one of them. And it behooves all of us to just understand it and to try to use it responsibly, but to be thinking about the implications and what it's going to do. And so for me, it's hard to really project it all forward because it's changing so fast. But I've talked to a number of folks at companies that are huge and that create infrastructure. And it's clear that a lot of effort is going into enabling single creators to make games. And I think creators who are technical and really can pull together pieces that maybe aren't fully mature yet can already do that. Like now, today, single creators can make games with AI. But I think as those pipelines mature and get better, it's going to unlock creativity for a lot of people. And that is a really cool thing. I think there's dangers and, all sorts of considerations around being fair to other creators in terms of training models. So I don't want to gloss over any of that stuff, but the coolest part is just that it's enabling creativity.
Makes sense. Do you think bigger companies or smaller companies get the most out of this new era of AI and tech?
That's a thought-provoking question. I had dinner with somebody who works at Meta last night, and I don't think until I caught up with him that I even understood the scale of the impact that AI is having on companies like Meta. So from a scale perspective, big companies for sure. But from an individual creativity perspective, I think today for games, we haven't seen the impact as much, but I really believe that impact is going to be profound and soon.
Makes sense. And then another theme I want to touch on is the player's perspective in all of that, because I've heard stories even during GDC this year where when players realize there's AI in the game, they will just extremely downvote and they can ruin a game's reputation. Do you think that will change, or what do you think about this happening?
I think there will always be critics out there, and again, I think there are legitimately things to be critical of. But already, games like our graders that have some amount of generative AI use, they get criticized, but they are hugely successful. So there's just no question that if you build a good game, however you built it, it will find an audience.
Yeah, so that's not an excuse for a game not being extremely successful. Makes sense. So closing off, if you had to give some advice for what's to come the next couple of years, and what should people try to do more of, to other game founders, production directors, CEOs in the space, what would you say?
I think now more than ever, taking the time to experiment and understanding the possibilities is so important because things are just changing at an incredible rate. And it's not certain where it's all going to land, but it is very certain that it's changing in ways that are bigger than the changes that we've experienced so far.
How would they do that?
You know, so many of the models and tools are just readily available to try, and it requires time and
perseverance.
Yeah, perseverance, and also just a willingness to dive into something and be completely out of your element. But I think change is always uncomfortable. Like, it's just a healthy thing to force yourself really to dive in and try it.
Awesome. Tim, thanks so much for taking this journey with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.